Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Sheetal. Welcome to today's webcast, which is titled Cultural Diversity and Inclusion, Where Do We Begin? My name is Sheetal, my pronouns are she and her, and I'll be presenting this session today. Now, before I begin, it would be remiss of me not to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands from where I'm dialing in from today. That's the beautiful Bundjalung country, the land of the Yugambeh language-speaking people. I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that from the first sunrise to the last sunset, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As a migrant to this country, I'm particularly privileged to be able to call their land my home and to enjoy many privileges that we are still advocating for our First Nations brothers, sisters as well. And if you're so inclined, feel free to share where you're dialing in from today. And if you don't know where you're dialing in from today, I encourage you to look that up and so we can collectively pay our respects. Now today's session, jam-packed session today, around cultural diversity and inclusion and how to get started. And I've had a little bit because I want us to keep going. So not only are we going to talk about how we get started, but what we need to do or what we can do to keep the momentum going, because this is just the start of the discussion. Now, who am I and why am I here? Why am I the one talking about this kind of stuff? So my name is Sheetal, my pronouns are she and her, as I mentioned. I'm a lawyer by qualification. Please don't hold that against me. So I came into legal practice and I wanted to do work in corporate sector, make a lot of money very quickly. Long story short, I came to understand how much privilege this role affords me. The key story being that when I walked into courtrooms, because I had particular credentials behind my name or initials behind my name, that meant I get to go to the front of the line or straight to the bench or straight to the bar to be able to have my matters heard, whereas someone who's self-represented potentially took the whole day off of work to spend that time to have their matter heard. Seemed like a bit of a disparity. Now, I then started working at the Queensland Law Society, and I began to see more and more the difference in the gap between the people who are meant to be serving the community, the lawyers, and the communities that we serve. For example, in one day I had a conversation with someone who was seeking benefits for lawyer organizations, and someone else I spoke to who was trying to get a grant approved for community members to, the program was called Go to Court, and it was to get go cards for people from rural communities so that they could go to their court hearings because they didn't have $10 to their name to put on a deposit to be able to access a go card. So then again, all of these things started to trigger my thought process around, wow, we are in a very unique position to help people. That's when the advocacy piece started to begin. I wanted to advocate for more equity within the legal profession. I also was seeing who was entering the legal profession and who was leaving the legal profession. And the diversity that was coming through was not being represented at higher levels in senior partnership roles, in the judiciary, and so on and so forth. And I know this story is not unique to the legal profession. We see a lot of it across many sectors. When I started to do this work, I realized many of the people in the diversity inclusion space didn't look like me. And there was a lot of people speaking about experiences that they didn't actually have lived experience of. So I may have started off as a lawyer, then I became an advocate because I saw that was a true calling for me in that. And then in the last few years, I've become a D&I practitioner by compulsion because in a former life, I had done critical race theory and gender and identity politics in an undergraduate back in Canada, which all came flooding back to me when I saw the kind of work we were doing in the diversity inclusion space and the polarity that was being created by people who didn't know what to do and how to do it, and the people who felt like we should all know better and be doing better already. So there were two opposite sides, and the person that I am, I wanted to sit right smack in the middle and bring people to have that conversation. So that's a little bit about me and why I'm here and why I feel so privileged to be able to start this journey for you. And for those who aren't starting this journey, I'm just really happy that you're here and we can continue on this journey. And that's one thing that we'll come to is we have to meet people where they are in this journey. No one was born woke. We are not necessarily taught these things in school. And if we look to our neighbors further away, they're constantly being eradicated from school. So it's a tough space to be in. It's a tougher space to try to navigate when you don't have that lived experience, lived expertise, or subject matter expertise. So before we jump into all the substantive content for today, and there's a lot of it, just some community guidelines that I'd really like to set the mood and the tone of the session for today. So open heart, open mind, only then can we start. So the experiences that you hear about today, whether they're my own or whether someone wants to share their experiences in the chat, they might not be our experiences, but that doesn't mean that those experiences aren't valid in their own right. Like I said, we're all here to learn. No one was born woke. So it's our collective responsibility to understand these things, but we're not here to blame, shame, or berate anyone for not knowing any better or not knowing this stuff any sooner, because where would you have learned this? Lastly, I want you to be mindful of a few things, yourself and your body. How are you feeling right now? Are we in a headspace to receive all of the information that's coming at you? Are there certain words that when we say will trigger certain feelings? Are our shoulders up to our ears already because we're talking about diversity and inclusion and, spoiler alert, maybe a bit of racism? So check in with yourself, and that's really indicative of how we feel about certain things. Also, if you're in a room watching this, who's in the room with you? And then more importantly, who's not in the room? Are there leaders in the room that could probably implement some of the strategies we'll talk about today? Are there people with lived experience in the room? If there are, you know that saying that used to be on cars, objects in mirror may seem closer than appear? Some of these stories may hit a little bit harder than we thought they would. They might be the person sitting beside you. They might actually even be you. So just being mindful of that, particularly if someone feels compelled or inspired to share, just being mindful that the experiences that we share may be triggering to some people. And if that's the case, feel free to, turn off the webinar, step aside, and take a breath and do what you need to do to take care of yourself in that moment. Cool. All right. So the first thing I'd really love to talk about is language versus literacy. So we hear a lot about inclusive language, and then we don't hear as much about improving literacy, but the distinction is actually really important. So language is how we communicate, yeah? It's a system of communication. Even think of languages, Hindi, English, love languages. It's a way that we communicate with someone what we're trying to say. We're trying to get a message across. That is communication. It's the ability to use and understand spoken words, signs, and symbols. Language. Literacy is a step above that because it's the ability to use and understand signs and symbols and words, plus the skills that we need to understand, interpret, and engage with the information. So it's the ability to comprehend what's being communicated. Stripping that down to the bare basics and the minimum, what's the difference? Language is knowing the word, so think of definitions, right? Literacy is knowing when and how to use the right words. So definition versus application. I know this seems really basic, but it's really important because if we're not using the right words to communicate things, we're not going to have a shared understanding. So if you're saying culture when we're trying to talk about race, we're not talking about the same things, and that's going to cause a bit of conflict. So in order for us to have a shared understanding, we have to have a shared language as well, and we have to have that literacy. So this is a key difference. Language is how we speak, inclusive language, super important, but I want us to level up a little bit and start thinking about improving our literacy across these diversity dimensions. Multicultural Month, we're going to talk about culture, ethnicity, and race, because over time, I feel, and through having done this a few times across different organizations and industries, there seems to be a conflation between what all of these terms mean. So, like I said, this is entry level, back to basics. We're going to talk about what each of those mean. Because it's important for us, Dr. Seuss, to say what you mean and mean what you say. So when we talk about race, race is a social construct. There's no biological basis to race. Social construct means it was created by society. It was created by society, if we want to go into the colonial history, to create a hierarchy, to deem some people as superior and some people as inferior based on the color of their skin. That's the history of race. It refers to the physical characteristics, the phenotypical characteristics of a person, skin color, hair, texture, facial features. So for me, my race is brown. I'm a brown-skinned woman. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is based on facts. It's based on geography. And now it refers to a shared background and heritage. For myself, I come from Girmitia ancestry. So when slavery was abolished, colonizers came up with a really unique system to circumvent that called a 2 to 5 year indentured labor agreements. And agreement, spoken by the Hindi language speaking people in India, agreement became Girmit. And then we became the Girmits. And that was when colonizers from British rule went to India and then took a whole bunch of Indians across to many places in the world. My family went to Fiji. There's some in Mauritius, Trinidad, Tobago, and so on and so forth. So that's why you'll find many people with Indian heritage, but very loose, if not removed ties to India. I have no relatives that I'm aware of in India, but I still have that Indian heritage by virtue of 5 to 6 generations being in Fiji. That's my ethnicity and my heritage and my cultural background, which brings me to culture. Culture, again, is a social construct, which means it's created by society. It refers to the ideas, the customs, the social behavior of a particular people or society. So as you might be familiar, there's Australian culture, there's Matilda culture, there's cultures around a particular group of people and their ideologies. Now, I've given the example of Hinduism as a culture. Hinduism is also a religion, and religion can be racialized. And what I mean by that is people will assume based on someone's religious presentation, their race as well. So for example, if someone is wearing a hijab, they'll make an assumption about that person's race. So that's what we mean when we say religion can be racialized as well. Now, shifting from language to literacy, when we talk about cultural diversity and inclusion, this is my favorite part. So diversity is the range of differences, right? Including, but not limited to, sorry, the lawyer in me can't help bringing that into every session. Personal, physical, professional, social characteristics. Again, including but not limited to your race, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, age, social class, etc. So these are either personal characteristics or professional characteristics. It's the mix of all of us that is the sum of all of our parts. Yeah. Literacy, so going a level above language, is understanding which of those diversity dimension applies and acknowledging that there's diversity within those diversity dimensions. What does that mean? So knowing when we're talking about culture, we're talking about the shared belief systems. Knowing when we're talking about race, we're talking about skin color, hair texture. When we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about someone's heritage and geographical background. Diversity within those dimensions is appreciating that there's no homogeneity within those diverse groups. Not all brown people present the same. Not all Hindus practice the same. Not all gay people present the same. There's diversity within those diverse groups. I'll come back to why that distinction is really important, but essentially it's around we can't have one person being representative of the entire group because that will, one, polarize people who are trying to look for that representation, because I can tell you from experience, if I don't see people who look like me being gay, it made me think that maybe I wasn't supposed to be. So it's really important to have the diversity of representation and visibility as well. So that's diversity. Now looking at inclusion. Inclusion is creating a sense of belonging for people regardless of those diversity dimensions. And one of my other roles is working with the Diversity Council of Australia. And it would be remiss of me to not mention that they have an incredible definition on inclusion, which talks about the importance of someone feeling valued, someone feeling respected, someone feeling like they have a sense of connection, a sense of belonging where they are. And further 2 points being that they feel like they can progress within the space that they're in, and they can contribute to something bigger than themselves. So those 4 key components, as identified through research from DCA, is the core keys to inclusion. But for our purposes today, we can probably reduce that to feeling respected, feeling valued, and feeling connected. Literacy, then, building on that language, is understanding that that belonging looks differently for everyone and requires different things from different people in different places. So there's that distinction between equality and equity. Some of us might have seen, there's a popular diagram where people are looking over a fence to try to see a game, something sports ball related, I'm sure. And everyone's given a little box to stand on, but they're all of different heights, and one person's actually in a wheelchair. Equality is giving everyone the same size box, but that's not going to get everyone to see sports ball. We need to be able to adjust to what people's specific needs are in order for everyone to be able to see. So that's the difference between equality and equity. That's the key for inclusion. This is building our literacy around what inclusion is. Yeah, so it's not just creating a safe space. I know that's become a hot button topic, but it's creating a space where people feel like they can contribute. They feel like they do belong. How inclusive do we think a space would feel if we have tables that are too low for someone to pull up a wheelchair to? That's not a very inclusive space for that person. So we have to have adjustments. We have to have a recognition that different requirements are needed for people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different abilities, and so on and so forth. And you can't see the shirt, but if it's not intersectional, it's not inclusive. And what that means is we have to apply an intersectional lens, which brings me to my next favorite topic after this one. So I'm going to put this into real terms and use an example of language versus literacy. And this is a topic very close to my heart. I seem to be saying that a lot. This is all topics very close to my heart. So racial discrimination. Definition is to discriminate against a person because of their race, color, descent, national origin, or ethnic origin and immigrant status. Ethnic origin and immigrant status different in the sense that they relate to ethnicity, but for the purposes of this legal definition, they've been grouped in. Now, literacy is understanding that anyone who is racialized, and spoiler alert, that's everyone. You can be racialized as white, you can be racialized as brown, you can be racialized as black. Everyone can be racially discriminated against. Anyone can be discriminated against because of the color of their skin. That is racial discrimination. That's a legal concept defined through the Racial Discrimination Act. Sorry, lawyer, can't help it. Racism is racial discrimination, which we just talked about, plus race-based societal power. Literacy is understanding that race-based societal power is the power that some people have in society because of their race. Now, remember when I talked about race being constructed to create a hierarchy? This is the legacy of racism. That hierarchy is entrenched into racism. This is why concepts like reverse racism don't make sense, because there's not enough race-based societal power by a marginalized community for it to be racism. It would be racial discrimination, which is a cause of action at law. This is the difficulty. When we don't have racial literacy, we confuse the two because we're not using the right words to talk about the right concepts. We're saying racism when we perhaps mean racial discrimination. So it's really important to understand what each of these terms mean, and literacy is knowing when to use them. Racial discrimination, legal concept with legal consequences. As I said, is a cause of action. There's discrimination laws against that as well. Racism is a social concept, and it still has social consequences. So just knowing the distinction between the two. So that is an example of the difference between language and literacy and why the two are important. This is also why it's important for us to use the right words for things and not brush over race by talking about culture, because neither of these apply in those circumstances. So say what you mean and mean what you say. Now, if it's not intersectional, it's not inclusive. What does that mean? Let's look at language, and then let's look at literacy. So the history of intersectionality. Now, this has become another very hot button topic across Australia, across the world. But do we know its origin story? So Kimberly Crenshaw, she wrote a paper about demarginalizing the intersection of gender and race. And that paper, which is publicly available, open source document, refers to 3 legal cases, because she was another lawyer, a Black scholar, that talked about discrimination laws and how they were falling short because they didn't apply an intersectional framework. Now I'll go through the case study. It was GM Motors, and we were looking at cases brought forward by Black women who felt they were being discriminated against. And long story short, GM Motors was of the position that we're not discriminating against women because there are women that are in these leadership roles, and we're not discriminating against or culturally and racially marginalized or brown and Black men people because there's Black men and brown men in these roles. And then the Black women kind of sat and thought, but that's just addressing one type of woman, and that's only addressing one segment of race. So Kimberly Crenshaw then noted that there was a compounding marginality that's felt by people who sit at intersections of these diversity dimensions, and we need laws and practices and policies and procedures that address that. Now, this concept of compounding experiences already existed. So Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term in 1989, but Sojourner Truth, who wrote an amazing paper called Ain't I a Woman, which I recommend you look into as well, so that introduced these concepts of compounding experiences. Now, the definition of intersectionality, as provided by Kimberly Crenshaw, is it's a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking. Let's unpack that a little bit. So it's understanding in the GM Motors example that if we look at things in narrow lenses of diversity dimensions, sure, women weren't being discriminated against because there were women in those roles. People that were Black and brown weren't being discriminated against because there were people that were Black and brown in those roles. But there weren't Black and brown women in those roles. So if we just thought conventionally in terms of these diversity dimensions as single issues, which we can't do because we don't live single issue lives, hat tip to Audre Lorde, we needed to look through an intersectional framework, which allows us to see that not only are people women, they are Black women and brown women and brown gay women as well. So they sit at intersections across different diversity dimensions. Now, when we apply that definition, what does that look like? It's identifying that and understanding that intersectionality is about systems that marginalize, not individual identities. It's about the isms, racism, which is a derivative of colonialism, classism, derivative of capitalism, sexism, derivative of patriarchy. So our issues are not with white people, it's with colonization and the legacy that it's left behind, because that's traumatic for white people also. Classism and capitalism, our issue is not with rich people, it's the system that we now are built, the system that society is now built into. Our issue aren't with men and sexism, it's with the patriarchy and toxic masculinity. So it's really shifting away from looking at things on an individual basis, even things like racism, shifting away from looking at it from person to person to understanding how deeply embedded this is into the fabric of the society, into the fabric of this country. And we're not going to be able to unravel that until we actually start using the words that we need to and improving that racial literacy. Now, this is a good illustration that I like to use. It was from a paper from Marilyn Frye in 1983, The Politics of Reality, and it was Essays in Feminist Theory. Now, if you look at that birdcage, it illustrates the impact of multiple and interlinked oppressions and discriminations. So the story goes, or the metaphor is that if we just look at one wire of a birdcage, we don't see it as particularly oppressive. You just fly around it, right? Simple enough. But when there are multiple and compounding wires and compounding marginalities on a person, we can see how it then becomes more difficult for a person to be able to navigate their way around it. A further difficulty is that you can't readily identify that, oh, this wire is gender, this one's gender identity, this one's sex, this one so on and so on. I'll just start clipping which ones I need to get out of it. You can't tell which one's which. You have to remove all of it. You have to lift up the cage altogether or break it down altogether at the same time. That is truly taking an intersectional framework. We can't prioritize diversity dimensions. When we talk about women, when we talk about gender equality, Gender equality for which women? Are we talking about white women? Are we talking about women with disability? Are we talking about brown women, brown gay women, and so on and so forth? It's recognizing that if we address policies and procedures from a place where we're looking at the most marginalized group and improve systems for them, it benefits everyone. And these systems of oppression aren't additive, right? They're interlocking, like that birdcage. Think of, instead of saying I'm a woman and I'm a brown woman, I'm a woman and brown and queer and so on and so on. It's I'm a brown woman that's gay. All those things exist simultaneously. It's very difficult for me to carve out pieces and say this part of me is woman, this part of me is brown, this part of me is queer, and so on and so forth. All of that combined creates this. So we are the sum of all of our parts. And if we keep saying that we're trying to create an authentic space for us to bring our whole selves, why are our policies and procedures prioritizing parts of us? Think about that for a second. You want me to bring my whole self, but then you want me to prioritize the woman part so I can participate in this initiative. You want me to prioritize this part of myself. Do you know how difficult that is for someone to try to carve out pieces of yourself? Think of you as a person, so many identities that you would hold, regardless of whether they fall into diversity dimensions or not. If someone asked a mother to say, carve out the mother part and just be the lady, just be the wife, just be the this, the partner, and so on and so forth, how difficult. You're all of those things, and that's what makes us great. So how can we possibly be asking people to bring their authentic selves to work when we're asking them to simultaneously carve out pieces of themselves? Now let's bring it all together. Some of the key takeaways that I want to leave you with, and I wanted to leave time for questions, and then I want to give you this practical tool that I've created, because all this stuff can be really overwhelming and it feels a lot bigger than us, but we can make a difference, and we can make a really big difference, and I want to get to that piece. So key things that I'd love for you to take away, screenshot this, take a photo. The difference between language and literacy, and we want to aim for literacy. When we know better, we can do better. And you're here because you want to learn and you want to do better. Saying what we mean and mean what we say. Please stop conflating culture with race. Express call out to look at the International Day of Elimination of Racial Discrimination and not hijack that with Harmony Week, where we prioritize culture. Talk about race. When we want to talk about racism, we have to talk about race. We can't talk about, they're different things. They're not against each other. They're all in their own right. But if we put the two together, it just is discongruous. It makes it sound like I'm un-Australian because I'm not talking about harmony and culture and the wonderful multiculturalism of this country. It is multicultural. It is a wonderful country. We also inherently have a race problem in this country, and that's okay. The thing is, we have to address the problem. We have to acknowledge there's a problem for us to be able to address it, right? So call a spade a spade. Talk about race, we want to talk about racism. Talk about culture when we talk about multiculturalism, and don't pit the two of them together. Racism and racial discrimination. This is another pet peeve of mine that I'd like to share, because one has legal ramifications and one is a social concept that has societal implications as well. Many trainings available on the differences between the two. Australia and Australian organizations have a habit of approaching D&I work from a regulatory point of view, which is looking at the racial discrimination side of things. Tell me what I need to do to not get in trouble. There's a big difference between not being exclusive and being inclusive. So what are we working towards? Not being exclusive or trying to work towards inclusion? Because the strategies between the two are big and far between. If it's not intersectional, it's not inclusive. If your gender equity plans aren't looking at women from different diversity dimensions, you're not looking at improving the case for women. Gender equity pay gap, we look at that, and we look at the stats around that. If we then looked at the stats around the gender pay gap for culturally and racially marginalized women, it's bigger still. So we can't be leaving people out of the conversation. on the topic of intersectionality, it's about systems of oppression. It's not just about complex individuals with intersecting identities and the matrix of privilege and marginalization. That is a part of it, but that is not all of it. We need to be looking at how those systems interact with each other to create compounding marginalization for people. Again, if we work to create a system, structure, procedure, policy that aims at making things better for the most marginalized individual or group of people, everyone benefits. A rising tide lifts all boats. So everyone benefits from that. There's been studies that show that when we create policies, procedures, practices, and so on that elevate that, people who already were enjoying privileges, they don't get less. They enjoy those added benefits as well. This environment becomes better for absolutely everyone. And like I said, if we want to create that space for our authentic selves, the sum of all our parts, we can't be looking at initiatives that prioritize parts of us. We can't ask our people, our friends, our family to leave parts of themselves at home when they walk through the door in the workplace, especially if we're going out to say that we're an inclusive workplace, we're an inclusive organization, we want people to bring their authentic selves. We can't claim to be a safe space and then invite someone into our home and then say, I don't really know how to cater to you. We learn how to do that before we invite someone home. We figure this stuff out, plenty of resources. It's not their job to teach us because there's so many people, including myself, that are taking on that opportunity, that are taking on that for people with lived experience as well. Also, why it's so important to have people with lived experience in these roles. Subject matter expertise and lived experience is so, so important in this work. Key thing, it's not our fault, but it's our collective responsibility. Again, no one was born woke. You chose the color of your skin and your sexuality as much as I chose mine. We didn't create these systems, but we can make them better. The legacy of colonization, capitalism, all of these things, no one in this room created them, but we can work to make it a more equitable space for the people that we love, the people that we care about. This stuff isn't easy, I know, but it's important stuff. And it's difficult to navigate. And something that's been very front of mind is that sometimes we feel like we have to understand these things, but our kindness shouldn't be contingent on comprehension. Just because I don't understand someone's lived experience doesn't mean I can't be kind to the experience that they've had. And on that, our curiosity about something doesn't trump someone else's comfort. And the example I often use is when people ask, where are you from? And I say Canada. And they continue to ask, no, really, where are you from? And I say Canada. Because that's the answer that I'm comfortable with. If I was more comfortable, I would tell you, and if I had more time, to be honest, I would tell you that I'm born in Canada, my parents were born in Fiji, 5-6 generations back, we came from India. But you're not entitled to that information, regardless of your intention. Even if you're just curious, you just want to know more about me and this wonderful caramel skin and where I got it from, you're not entitled to my lived experience. And even when we are getting people to share their stories and ask them, we don't have to trot them out to share their lived experience because that could be potentially very traumatizing for them. When we hire people with lived experience, we're not hiring them for the sake of sharing their story with us time and time and time again. We're hiring them because their lived experience informs the way they show up and informs what contributions they make. So when we say centering lived experience, that's not saying that we're centering everyone's story time and time again, because we're not entitled to anyone's story. Inclusive listening. We want to listen to learn. I know it sounds like basic things, but these are such core principles. We want to listen to learn about experiences that may very well be different than what we have. And listening to the right people. What's being talked about, and are they appropriately placed to do so? I'm not going to talk about First Nations reconciliation because I'm not a First Nations person. But if I was asked to talk about it, I would then speak to someone else and connect them to someone who does have that lived experience and lived expertise. If we're talking about LGBTQ allyship, I'm going to talk to someone from the LGBTQ community. What does allyship look to what does allyship look like for them. So making sure that we often hear this, nothing about us without us, right? There's a reason that's said, because they're best placed to advise on what their community needs. Another thing we often hear in these spaces is we're giving a voice to the voiceless. We're not voiceless, we're just not being heard. Why are we not being heard? Because we're not in the room sometimes. Because our voices are being drowned out by louder voices. Our voices aren't being invited to speak at those events. So this concept of people aren't voices, this concept that, people are voiceless and we're giving a voice to the voiceless, don't do that. We're amplifying voices. We're passing the microphone to voices. We're sharing and holding space so other voices can speak, but we're not giving someone a voice. That creates an inherently problematic dynamic of saviorism and not good things. And like I said at the outset, we want to meet people where they're at in this journey. And this journey is like that song that never ends. This journey just keeps on going and going and going, and it's ever evolving. Once upon a time, it was okay to say things like, that's so gay, or that's so lame. We don't say those things now because it's diminishing. It's ableist language, it's homophobic language. We didn't know that 20 years ago, and there's probably things that I'm saying today in 10 or 20 years' time we'll learn is not as appropriate as it was perhaps today. And that's okay. This is why we need to have so much compassion in this space, because we're learning these things as we go. We're unlearning as we go. And no one's, like I said, no one's born woke. No one has this all figured out. So we have to hold compassion. We have to hold space. We have to meet people where they are. We have to trust that their intentions are good. And even if we're the people that have the good intentions, we have to trust that it's our impact that matters more than our intention. If we've hurt someone by something we've said and they've told us that, they've had the courage to tell us that we've hurt them, it's not appropriate for us to say, well, I didn't do that. I didn't mean to do that. We did it. We understand, we learn, and we move on. So that's kind of some guiding steps and principles on how we get started and some little one-liners to take away. But how do we keep it going? Now, I've been in this space for many a year now, and I've tried to think about how to create impact in this space. And I've gone from beating myself up because I wasn't an activist and I wasn't going to all the rallies, and then I've gone to the other side where I can't do anything because I'm completely helpless and nothing I do is going to make any difference. And through that, through the subject matter expertise, through lived experience, through this wonderful career and journey that I've been able to kind of piece together, I've come to this model, which is what you can do, you watching right now, can do for social change in a way that leans into your strengths, aligns with your values, and is sustainable. So take a picture. Firstly, what brings you joy? What are the things that you like to do? And this is similar to the Ikigai model that people might be familiar with, but it's built on that because I've added some additional circles. In particular, what identities do you hold? So I'm a brown, gay woman. In the legal profession, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a partner, I am many things. So what identities do you hold? And this is an exercise that you can go through. So actually map that out. Bring your chart paper. What identities do you hold? Write it all out. What are the things in the world that you see need to be changed? Or closer to you, what are things in your workplace that you see need to be changed? Write all that stuff out. What communities are you a part of? The legal community, the D&I community, hospitality, government, whatever communities, parenting, whatever communities you're a part of, your circle of impact, so to speak. And then what are your strengths? And there's plenty of tools around this that you can look up. What are you good at? Writing? Advocacy? Drawing? Art? Singing? Dancing? What are your strengths? Again, write all that stuff out. And then of those things, what brings you joy? What do you like doing? Do you like talking to people? Do you like presenting? Do you like writing stories, fiction, so on and so forth? When you do and go through that exercise, where you see the overlap of all of those things, that's what you can do for social change in a way that's sustainable for you. Now, I'm going to show you what that looks like in real time using me as an example. So what identities do I hold? I've gone through that, been there, done that. What needs to be changed? For me, it was immediately within the legal profession and within the D&I space. And I saw people who didn't look like me talking about my lived experience. And this is a story that if you've ever heard me speak before, was the game-changing moment for me when I walked into a room, and it was for an LGBTQ networking professional pride event held by wonderful organizations. I went in, and like most rooms, I was the only brown person in the room. And the session was about mentorship and the importance of visibility. You can't be what you can't see, right? We've heard that so many times before. So I sat there thinking, well, one, I can't be anything here because I don't see anything like anyone like me. And maybe I shouldn't be here. And maybe this isn't me. Again, going back to why I talked about diversity within diverse groups. That representation is really important because for someone who's coming out, someone who doesn't see themselves reflected in those opportunities, it becomes very fracturing. So what needed to be changed? I saw the need for more people from diverse backgrounds to be in these spaces because I didn't want people to feel like I did, like I didn't belong in that space. And there was a wonderful human at that event who turned to me and said, sometimes if you can't see it, you have to be it. That's what needed to change. What communities was I a part of at the time? I worked at the Law Society. I was part of the legal profession. So that was the immediate community that I thought of. And then what were my strengths? I do public speaking okay, or as some people tell me, I speak English good sometimes. So that was something that I thought was a strength of mine. What could I do? What tools did I have available to me? And what brings me joy? If you haven't picked up on it already, this stuff brings me incredible joy. I love bridging gaps. I love making connections. I love trying to break down things that are otherwise uncomfortable or difficult and making them accessible. Accessibility is huge for me. That brings me so much joy. So when I sat and I looked at all of these things and I thought, well, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And this is it. This is what I do. This is what I do for social change. I talk to communities now beyond the legal profession into Queensland, into Australia, internationally, about the importance of centering lived experience and talking from the identities that you hold. It's addressing the change that's needed, which is we need more representation of people in decision-making positions around decisions that are being made for those people. And I do it in a way that's sustainable. It terrifies me. Public speaking absolutely terrifies me, but I love it so much, and I'm somewhat okay at it. It brings me joy. It's a strength of mine. I do it to the communities that I'm immediately around, and that community, I'm so grateful, continues to grow and grow and grow. And I do it in a way that is sustainable. I do it in a way that is authentic to the identities that I hold. And I do it in a way that I feel is addressing change, because even if one of the, I'm told, 300 registrations today picked up on something, that ripple effect, I'll never know the difference that will make. And that's powerful. And if you take that and you apply this model to your life today, you'll be doing the exact same thing. You won't know the difference you've made, and that's okay. You'll just see slowly but surely the world around us getting a bit better, a bit nicer, a bit more inclusive. Beyond that, what else can you do? It's Multicultural Queensland Month, and Multicultural Queensland have put on many more events. So with that framework, with that thinking, with this foundation that we've laid out today, when you go and register for the other 3 webinars, which I hope you will, if you haven't already, think of those things, think as these topics come through, how you create welcome, how to use an interpreter, how can I apply these learnings to my life in a way that brings me joy, in a way that leans into my strengths, in a way that impacts my my circle of impact, in a way that is authentic to who I am. So I'm not speaking on behalf of people. I'm speaking truth to power from my identity, from my lived experience. And then when we wrap it up with that last webinar on the 30th around how to be anti-racist in the workplace, bring it all together, because this is a journey. It's a journey that doesn't end. And I can guarantee you now, at the end of that session, you're not going to walk away with a certificate that says I'm anti-racist, tick, because it's an ongoing thing. It's something that we do on a daily basis. It's like running. If I run one time, I'm not a runner, though you never find me running unless someone's chasing me. You have to do it consistently, regularly, and only then can you call yourself an advocate. Only then can you call yourself ally. Only then can you call yourself a social citizen of this world that we live in. Ongoing journey. Like I said, it's tough stuff. It's not easy, but it's important. Because you know what? We're only 1 or 2 life decisions away from falling into one of those marginalized categories. So leverage the privilege and power you have to make the situation better, because your sibling or you might be someone who needs that support in years to come. And for some of us, that's inevitable. We know ageism is a thing, and we're all going to get old, though we might not look it. So we need to prepare, and we need to do better, if not for the only reason that it's going to affect us at one stage too. So with that, we've got time for some questions. If there are any questions that are burning and coming through. Otherwise, I have put my contact information on there. If you want more information on the model, if you want me to workshop the model through your organizations or talk through your organization on anything we've touched on today or other topics as well, you can reach me. The QR code is available, and we'll send you directly to my LinkedIn where you can connect with me and we can have a chat about how we can work together to make the world a more inclusive place. But for now, any questions? Excellent. Bear with me, I'm just reading these through. Hi, Sheetal, thank you so much for your enlightening talk. I would love to know what sources you're quoting from when you say those enjoying the most privilege don't get less. Yes, absolutely. So there's DCA has some wonderful research, Diversity Council of Australia, their Inclusive Workplace Index research. I will share that as post-event materials. There's a chart there that indicates survey that was done. So there's information on that. I had a question regarding diversity inclusion. Many organizations prioritize diversity over inclusion, especially during promotions. How do you approach such a situation? Could you share your thoughts? Wonderful question. We don't have a diversity problem, we have an inclusion problem. And diversity is not one of those situations where you add diversity and stir in it as a little cocktail. That's not quite how it works. We talk about psychological safety. This is becoming a thing, and positive duties and more legislation coming into that space. We don't unlock the power of diversity unless we create a space where someone feels connected, valued, like they can contribute, and they have opportunity to progress. So unless you're creating a space where someone from that diverse background can share all of that, and when I say diverse background, diversity of thought, experience, skin color, age, sexuality, and so on and so forth, whatever that mix of diversity is, if we're not creating a space where they feel comfortable sharing all of the stuff that they have because of those diversity dimensions, we're not unlocking the power of diversity. And herein lies the issue that people see with diversity inclusion initiatives going wrong. We're getting the how wrong. If we don't get this part right, we're not going to unlock the power. So all we've done is made the room more colorful, quite literally. So we're not actually unlocking the power of diversity unless we create an inclusion space. So the prioritization is about the inclusive space. Make the space inclusive first before you bring someone in. Otherwise, we've seen case examples, and I'll have difficulty finding this one. I just remember it from a long time ago, around if you're creating spaces where you're wanting people from non-binary backgrounds to attend the workplace, do you have gender neutral bathrooms? You have to create the space first and then invite people in. What is one simple thing I can do to put intersectionality into practice? For example, in my workplace, policy reviews. What are in your policies at the moment? What practices and policies are currently in place? Are they applying a intersectional framework? So with DCA, we're currently, I senior project manage the RISE project, which is looking at the intersection of gender and race and what barriers are in place for people from that lens. So that's then looking at not just gender, but gendered racism and what that looks like in the workplace. So policy review, recruitment processes, are we applying a racial, cultural, all these different diversity dimension lenses when we're doing that? A talent management, recruitment, promotions, and so on. So quite a few different things. Excellent. And I think those were the key questions. Someone has asked if the recording would be made available, and yes, it will be. If you visit the website where you found this webinar to begin with, you will see a recording of that in due course. Any other questions? I think that might be it. Excellent. Well, on that note, maybe I'll give you the next 9 minutes to workshop through. Oh, I'm going to refresh the page. How would you invite mainstream society to own or change their perception of the world word multicultural? Educate. Listen to people who are telling you the difference between the two. Send them a recording of this webinar. There's nothing wrong with multiculturalism, and even the language, culturally and linguistically diverse, and now we're seeing a different term of culturally and racially marginalized coming up. It's not a replacement. I'm just going to take that opportunity to make that very clear right now, because I've had many discussions around this. Culturally and linguistically diverse is different than culturally and racially marginalized. Culturally and racially marginalized is looking at a subset within culturally and linguistically diverse, because culturally and linguistically diverse is addressing someone who culturally is different and linguistically is different. No race in there whatsoever. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Virginia Mapedzama, talks about this using their beautiful daughter as an example, born in Australia, so Australian culture, speaks Australian, whatever that is, but is Black. So the discrimination she faces is not because she's culturally and linguistically diverse. She doesn't identify as culturally and linguistically diverse. She's culturally and racially marginalized. For me, I'm culturally and racially marginalized because I also, and more so in Canada, because culturally aligned, linguistically aligned, that's where that accent's coming from, but racially marginalized as well. So knowing the difference, this is why those languages are so important. And it's why it's so important to just build from language onto that literacy as well. Because without that literacy, all we think is, oh, CARM has replaced CALD. It has not. It is a further specification of the term. The Anti-Discrimination Act protects race as an attribute. If we experience racial discrimination in particular settings, we can seek recourse. What is the recourse when we experience racism? All experience at work in prescribed places is not discrimination. Sometimes it's plain racism. That's exactly right. This is a social problem. It requires society to address it, which is why we need to stop thinking of racism in terms of just racial discrimination. We need to undertake anti-racism training. We need to talk about race so we can talk about racism. So how do we address it? We start talking about it. We call a spade and stop making it such a difficult thing to talk about. I'm a brown woman. There are white people watching. The color of my skin, that's not racism. When you attribute certain stereotypes to the color of my skin, that's racism. But these are basics that people might not even be aware of. Race-based societal power are concepts people are not aware of. When we start understanding these things, those topics become less and less triggering and easier to talk about. So we need to talk about it. That is how we start. We need to talk. We need to talk about it. Recourse for racism is having more conversations about what that is and what redress looks like. I'm going to refresh again. Policies can be changed, but how do we change people and their perspectives? It takes time. It's a journey. We meet people where they are. We have to appreciate. We don't have to. We choose to appreciate that there is a lot of cultural entrenchment and learnings that people have to unlearn. Think about it. Some people's beliefs around racism or anti-racism or culture and ethnicity and so on are so deeply entrenched. When we're asking them to question, it's very easy to say open mind, open heart. That's where the change will begin to start. But getting to a place where you're vulnerable enough to say, I'm willing to have my foundational beliefs rocked to the core is very difficult. So it will take time to change mind and perspectives and things. I can tell you from a lived experience point of view, when I first came out to my parents, now 11 years ago, it's been a journey, and it's a journey that's taken a good 11 years. And they were 11 very tough years for everyone involved. But we were both committed to maintaining that relationship. We were both committed to figuring it out. So we sat in the yuck and just fought it out, talked it out, did what we need to get there. And that's the kind of dialogue that sometimes it takes to change people's minds and perspectives. And also being wary of this is not something that you have to take on your own, and it's not something that you do all of the time, and you have to pick your battles. As anyone from a marginalized background or anyone who's faced any discrimination will know, if we picked a fight every single time there was an opportunity to, we would be very tired people. Doing this work it can be exhausting, but that's also why I choose when to have these conversations. I don't engage in every single opportunity there is to talk about race, because boy, does this country give us opportunities to talk about race. And have we seen what's happening in America? There's plenty of opportunities to talk about. We have to choose when and what we talk about for your own well-being as well, because it is a journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Small actions, events we can take in our community to foster belonging and inclusion. Great. If you're hosting events, can we check if we're hosting events that are accessible? If we're inviting people to dinner, can we check that they're in a space that they'll be able to feel comfortable ordering the food? They'll feel comfortable getting into the venue. Is it physically accessible for people to get in and out of the venue? So just being mindful of everyone, regardless of whether we know someone's attending. When I was working at the Queensland Law Society, we set up a diverse abilities network, and this is a vulnerability share. That was the first time I thought about thinking of accessibility needs, because it was for a group of people with disability. Now, that's a faux pas, because we should be thinking about creating a space that's inclusive, even if we don't know if people have disability. So approach it, again, looking at the most marginalized group, someone who is X, Y, Z across all these diversity dimensions. If I create a safe space for them, and a space that's accessible for them, it's going to be accessible for everyone. Creating a wheelchair ramp doesn't destroy the stairs. So someone who wanted to take the stairs, it's not preventing them from taking stairs. It just makes it accessible for someone else to be able to enter. How do we monitor and track? This is going to be the last question because I'm at 11:58. How do we monitor and track progress on diversity inclusion initiatives without people into broad categories for the purposes of data collection? I'm going to be really cheeky and say if you're not a member of Diversity Council Australia, I'd look into that, because that is a bulk of what we do. We are there to support organizations and workplaces in their D&I journey. Also, there's a lot of independent consultants as well that do this work as well. So you can always reach out to them. And I think, oh, I spoke too quickly on that one. Do I have time for one more? I think that might be it. With that, I will leave you. I'll say thank you so much for your time. Can I just say I really appreciate you taking out the time to listen to this content, listen to my lived experience. I encourage you to reach out if you have any further questions or concerns, or if you want more information on anything that was discussed today. But as I said, this is a foundational start, foundation of more discussions that we'll have over the coming month. And then I hope you will continue to have beyond this month, because we're not just a multicultural Australia or Queensland in the month of August. We're a multicultural Queensland and Australia every day of the week. And, you know, it's not just particular diversity days that highlight. We're not just those things on those particular diversity dimension days, we're those things every day of the week. So this is ongoing work, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for undertaking it.